Hello guys, welcome back to a Coder's Journey. This is episode number 6 of the Clean Architecture course on my channel. In episode 6, we are going to talk a little bit about entities, right? About invariants in domain-driven design and how we can implement them in the clean architecture solution that we've got here. So as you can see here right now, I am on episode number 6. This is the branch we're going to talk about in this episode. Back to the notes. So right now we have used the term entity a couple of times, right? The entity. So in this section, we're going to define what an entity is in domain-driven design, why it is important, and how to design entities with protection against invalid state. So always remember, you need to protect your entities against becoming invalid. And there are different techniques to do that, which we are going to cover one at a time. We will also introduce the idea of value objects a little bit, and we will explore value objects in more detail in the upcoming episodes. First, let's talk about entities in domain-driven design. So an entity in DDD is an object, and we can create a class inside of C# and .NET to kind of implement an entity. So the idea behind an entity is very simple. An entity needs to have an identity, a distinct identity. And it is through this distinct identity that you distinguish one entity from another one. So this is represented by an ID, right? And then entity maintains its identity throughout its lifetime. So from when an employee entity is created, for example, fetched from the database until it is discarded, that identity, that ID field, ID property is going to stay the same. Even if other properties change, the ID will never change. And as I told you, it is with this ID, this identity, that you distinguish one employee from another one. Is often mutable. Mutable means it is able to change, right? The ID could change in very rare cases, but of course with many constraints. I don't want to talk about this one right now, but just keep that in mind that the ID of an entity could also be mutable. So if I take a look here, this is my employee. The ID of this employee, by the way, is inside of this base class, which we are going to talk about. But I told you in the previous episode, let me commit these changes. So I showed you here that this entity has an ID, right? So for example, an employee is an entity because it has a unique ID and its name or department might change, of course. Value objects, let's talk briefly about value objects. So value object, again, it can be implemented using a class or a record. In C#, it has no identity, is defined based on the values that are stored inside of its properties if you are, for example, working with a record. And of course, it is immutable. Value objects cannot change. If you want a different set of properties for a value object, you are not allowed to change the values inside of the current instance of a value object. You need to create a new instance. So a value object is immutable. And I'm going to show you how to implement value objects. There are actually very good examples of creating value objects in our project. We'll explore value objects in more detail. So let's talk about the base entity class. Many entities share common behavior, such as equality based on the identity, domain event tracking, audit properties, and so many other stuff. So it makes sense to encapsulate all of these, common behavior, right? And put them inside of a base entity class so that other classes, other entities can reuse them, can inherit from them. This is the reason why I have decided to create this base class. And of course, we're going to evolve this base class as well. We've got this base class called entity. It's abstract. It has this common ID. So because every single entity needs to have an ID, a unique ID, I have decided to move this to this class. And then of course, as you can see here, it has a protected constructor in which we are setting the value for this, ID. So let me show you what I mean here. So if I go to episode number 6, if you take a look here in the common folder, I have this abstract class, right? So this entity base is abstract. It is, of course, a class, right? And it has this common ID, and then it has this constructor and other entities, like, for example, employee, as you can see, is inheriting from this entity base class. Again, you cannot see the ID here anymore because the ID is coming from the entity. Sure. Then you've got your private setters, and then you've got your constructor, a public constructor that we're going to refactor in a little while. And then we are calling the base constructor of our abstract entity class. Updating the employee entity, this is what I told you about. Protecting invariants with guard clauses. Let's talk a little bit about invariants. So what are invariants? Invariants, as the name suggests, are rules that must always be true for an entity to be in a valid state. For example, suppose for an employee, the full name cannot be null, never. So we need to make sure we have a way to preserve, right, our entity, to protect our entity against this, violation. So we need to have a way. We need to make sure we cover every single scenario. So one instance of a place where full name can be set to an empty string is inside the constructor. So whenever a new instance of this entity is going to get created, we're going to protect the full name. This is an invariant for our entity. We're going to make sure full name is not set to an empty string. Another place is the setter of the full name property itself, right? So by using this private, we are protecting our entity against that violation. Another place could be like a method called update name. So again, in that case, we need to make sure that the string, which is going to be assigned to full name, is never null or empty. So invariants are rules that must always be true for an entity to be in a valid state. For example, an employee must have a valid name. An employee must belong to a department. By enforcing these rules in the constructor, we make sure that entity is never created in an invalid state. And of course, as I told you, there are other places that we need to think about, that we need to consider when we are thinking about protecting our entities against the violations of, invariants. I'm going to talk about this NuGet package, ardalis.guard clauses. This ardalis.guard clause, it's a NuGet package that it can help us tremendously when it comes to protecting our entities against the violation of these invariants. You can add this package very easily, right? And of course, as you can see here, I've got a playlist on my channel about guard clauses. I highly recommend that playlist. If you don't know about guard clauses, I think it's the perfect time to take a look at that playlist as well. And using guard clauses, you can protect your entities against, the violations of those invariants in a very defensive, expressive, clean, and readable state. I have talked about guard clauses in that playlist that I told you. I'm not gonna, talk about them here a lot. You can check out that playlist if you want, but just to take a look here, I've installed, as you can see, the Ardalis guard clause, right? And then here inside of the constructor of this entity, I am creating guard clauses for the ID, for full name, and for department ID based on my invariants. So the full name cannot be null or white space. I am guarding against that. And the department ID and the ID itself are also protected inside of the constructor. I told you in the upcoming episodes, I'm going to turn this constructor into a factory method, and I'm going to tell you why a factory method is a preferable way compared to a constructor, but more on that later. So the summary. Now, Entities are the central modeling, piece when it comes to clean architecture. They have identity. The identity can change in very rare occasions, but the other, properties might change during the lifetime of an entity. Then we talked about having a base entity class with the shared, properties, like for example, the ID of an employee. And then we talked about protecting the invariants of an entity. So the invariants of an entity are the rules that always need to be in place for an entity to be considered valid. And then we talked a little bit about the Ardalis guard clauses package that can help us to guard against the invalid values that try to sneak into the entity through the constructor or other like methods that we are going to add to this entity. So that's the end of this episode. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. Don't forget, you can get the source code of these videos using the link inside of the description, and I'll see you in the next episode.